Would you like to find out how you can reverse engineer the content repurposing process to ensure that you are validating your content ideas and only creating content that your audience wants to consume? Find out how in this episode.
Welcome to the Content 10X Podcast, the show where content creators learn how to harness the power of content repurposing. And now, your host, Amy Woods.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10X Podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, founder of Content 10X, and in this week's episode, it's all about creating content MVPs. Wouldn't it be great if you only ever created content that your audience wants to consume? After all, it's really time consuming to create great quality content. It's such a shame if we create content that just doesn't hit the spot. But it happens to everyone. Content tumbleweed, unfortunately, is just one of those things. But I'm about to explain how you can reverse engineer the content repurposing process so that you validate your content ideas and therefore create content that you know your audience loves and wants to consume. Now, it's all about creating a content MVP. What's an MVP? So a minimum viable product is about creating a version of a product or service that has just enough features to be able to gather feedback, test assumptions, and validate the idea. Now, it avoids building something that people don't want, saving time and money. Now, in the book The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, Eric defines an MVP as a version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learnings about customers with the least effort. Now, when your MVP has been released, you can then improve it over time based on the feedback and so on. This is far more preferable to the opposite of spending the maximum amount of effort and time creating something to get an advanced version of a product or service before it's been released with no validation or testing. Now, I like to call this the Field of Dreams approach, referring to the 1989 Kevin Costner film, where the main character hears this voice saying, "Build it and he will come." So he turns a cornfield into a baseball pitch with this blind faith that it'll all work out. Now, blind faith is not the best approach in business. So how can you create a content MVP? Well, creating content can take a lot of time and effort. So before you embark upon your next long form piece of content, your next epic blog post, cornerstone article, podcast episode, video, webinar, validate the idea first. So how do you do that? I'm always talking about repurposing your long-form content into bite-sized social media content, but here we're going to do the reverse. You develop your idea into an outline or a plan, then before turning that plan into the main event, create social media content sharing the key ideas. You could write some LinkedIn posts, share some tweets, create short-form stories videos. What you're doing here is testing the response. Share enough for your audience to understand what you're proposing. Now, you don't have to be backward about what you're doing as well. If you want to just ask your audience if they want to hear more on this topic, then go ahead and do that. For example, write a general LinkedIn post about your topic, maybe break down one or two of the key points you want to make and ask, would you want to hear me talk more on this? Or be more specific, if I were to create fill in the blank about this topic, would you be interested? Would you want that? It could be a good idea to actually validate the idea first as well. So validate the topic, see if people engage, if people are interested. And once the topic is validated and you're happy you're going to go and create content about that, validate the format. Should it be a blog post? Should it be a podcast series? Should it be a webinar? And so on. So validate the idea, then validate the format. And this process can work for all sorts of content, not only your evergreen content or episodic content, but it works for things like lead magnets. So before you create that next PDF checklist or ultimate guide to, validate it first. Hey, just a little break from this week's episode to let you know about becoming a Content 10X Insider. If you want more content repurposing tips and advice, then why not join hundreds of business owners, marketers and content creators who get them delivered straight to their inbox once a week by subscribing to the Content 10X newsletter. As well as tips and advice, you get industry updates, inspiring stories, exclusive content, offers and more. You can subscribe at content10x.com/newsletter and there's a link in the show notes too. Okay, back to this week's episode. And it's a really good idea to pay attention to what audience responds the most favourably to. For example, if your LinkedIn audience didn't really bite, you shared a text post and a short video and no one seemed too responsive, but then you also shared on Twitter and people were really keen, then have a think about who your Twitter audience are. For example, if you have a B2B business and your LinkedIn folk are B2B and Twitter are mainly B2C, then at least you know that the topic seemed to be more what your B2C audience wanted, and that's really great insight. Because gathering this insight, getting feedback and the responses, that helps you make that next move. You're used to hearing me say that you should take longer content and break it down into social media content, but with a content MVP, it's kind of reverse engineering, because I'm saying take the concept of a long piece of content, turn it into shorter pieces first, validate and then create the big piece. And look at how you may be able to incorporate the shorter form content into your final piece. For example, if you share a few LinkedIn posts and get the green light to go ahead, maybe you'll be able to repurpose some of those posts into the next version of the content. Were they blog posts that were almost mini articles that could become a section in the main blog post? Did you create graphics for a carousel post or LinkedIn slider post that you could feature in the article or the video? So the point really is you may be able to repurpose what you created for the validation into your main content. And you know me, I always say create content with repurposing in mind. And it might not surprise you that I created some MVPs of this topic on social media before creating this video about content MVPs. And just a fun fact, so I mentioned the film Field of Dreams earlier and not following the build it and they will come approach. Blind faith isn't a great strategy, but what's so funny is Field of Dreams is actually an example of repurposing and validation too, because the film was based on a book called Shoeless Joe, so a book repurposed into a film, but Shoeless Joe was validated as a short story first. Before it became a book, Shoeless Joe Jackson Comes to Iowa was a 20-page short story that the author W.P. Kinsella penned for an anthology. So good feedback on his short story led to the book, which led to the film. Now this was all in the 80s before social media, so maybe if it were today, the short story would have been a Facebook post first, which would have led to the short story, book and then the film. So there you go. I just think that's quite a funny story given the irony of what the concept was in Field of Dreams, but how that actually came about to be a movie. So next time you are planning out an epic piece of content, validate it first. Go create your content MVP and let me know how you get on. Okay, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe on your favourite app so you never miss an episode. And you can also subscribe to the weekly Content 10x newsletter to get the episode delivered to your inbox, along with loads more tips and advice on repurposing, exclusive content news, offers and more. Head to content10x.com/newsletter to become a Content 10x insider. I promise you won't regret it. And if you want help with your repurposing, then check out our fully end-to-end content repurposing service here at Content 10x. I promise you're in good hands with us if you want to maximise your content but leave the hard work to experts so that you can focus on your business. So just head to content10x.com to find out about everything that we could do to support you. And if you prefer a more DIY approach, or you'd like to empower your team, or just learn more about repurposing, then do get a copy of my book, Content 10x, on Amazon, and check out the Content 10x Toolkit. That's at content10x.com/toolkit. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.